Hello, Amplify Conference. It is good to be with you, although not actually with you, but through use of technology, we do get to be together and talk about this such an important topic, and that's the topic of evangelism, and particularly right now. And so I'm so glad that we're able to do this conference online because by all accounts right now, a spiritual interest is probably higher right now than perhaps any other time in our lifetime. Maybe you've heard this, maybe you haven't, but Google searches, which tells us a lot about what people are looking for, is now spiked as far as the searches for God, searches for prayer, searches for church, and even church online, all-time high. YouVersion has seen a dramatic increase in the traffic for the Bible reading and also their Bible reading plans. So this is a moment for people like you and for people like me who are passionate about evangelism and gifted in evangelism to do evangelism and equip other people to do exactly the same. But of course, now the question is how? How do we do it? And I'll tell you what, I have tried a lot of things over the years, and I've tried a lot of things that didn't work. I mean, I was motivated like you by the Great Commission of Matthew 28 to go and make disciples. And so one of the things I did early on, in college, I tried street evangelism. I was out there literally on the street harassing poor, helpless strangers, and I would get that look. And if you've ever done that, you know the look like, are you a crazy person? And so finally I gave up on that. I was inspired by Jesus' vision in Acts 1:8. The promise is, hey, you have to go from Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the ends of the earth. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to start and canvass my neighborhood. And I started going door to door, knocking on doors of people I didn't know. And maybe if you've done that, I got doors slammed in my face. I was challenged by 1 Peter 3:15 to always be prepared to give a defense. And so I was trained in the 2 diagnostic questions. Those questions so I could start a spiritual conversation. And so I'd throw out those 2 questions, and I'd have friends look at me like, why are you trying to trick me? What's going on here? And it was like one thing after another. It was like fail, fail, fail. And I was always on this search for just kind of there had to be a simple, everyday way to share your faith with other people. And like you, my life has been changed by Jesus and the love of God, and I wanted to share it with other people. And so my search, maybe surprisingly to me, led me again back to the Bible, back to the life of Jesus, and I discovered what we're calling 5 practices, the 5 bless practices. And I want to share them with you, and I think they're so simple that you're going to be able to share them with the people that you lead, or maybe if you're a pastor, the people in your churches. In many ways, when I say we, it was my brother and I and some of our friends at Community Christian Church. We first kind of began to explore this when I ran across a doctoral dissertation called Blessers versus Converters. Blessers versus Converters. Now, in this doctoral dissertation, they took this blessing approach right out of Genesis chapter 12, where God says to Abraham, hey, I'm going to bless you, and then you're going to bless the entire world. And so they sent 2 teams of missionaries, this is recorded in this dissertation, to Thailand. And they had 2 different teams went with entirely different strategies and approaches. One went as converters. They went and they said, hey, we're going to save souls. The other team went and they said, we're just going to go and bless people. We want to just bless them wherever we can. After, 2 years on the ground, they came back and recorded the results of these 2 teams with 2 distinctly different strategies. The blessers, on the one hand, when it came to social capital and social good, over here, the blessers, there was a lot of social good that was created, a lot of sense of community and a difference they made wherever they went. The converters, really nothing to speak of as far as social capital or a difference in the community. But then when it came to conversion, the converters, they saw 2 converts in those 2 years. And the blessers, according to this doctoral dissertation, 100 people. 100 people said yes to Jesus. And I remember reading that going, hold on. So this is a strategy for reaching people? Just a simple blessing strategy? And as we began to look, past Genesis chapter 12, then into the New Testament and the life of Jesus, we began to see different ways through the Gospels in Jesus' own life and ministry that he blessed people. And then with intention, we began to take a look at those different ways and said, okay, how could we explain that in a very memorable fashion so that people could also integrate that and then do it in their everyday life? And what we did is we kind of came up with, based on the life of Jesus and what he did, 5 everyday practices to bless your neighbor. And here they are, and I'll give them to you. First one, and they spell the word be, or blessing rather. It starts with be. Begin with prayer. A little bit of a stretch there, but stick with me. B is begin with prayer. L is for listen. E is for eat. The first S is for serve, and then the last S is for story. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with those, let me explain how we begin to see those really briefly in the life of Jesus. I mean, think about how did Jesus actually begin his earthly ministry? How did he begin his earthly ministry? Well, in Luke 6, it says the first thing it is, he went out on the mountainside and he prayed. He began with prayer. Prayer is both how you do the mission and how you discover your own mission. And so if you know a person that you want to reach, you pray. You begin by praying for that person. If you have a particular neighborhood or an affinity group or an office, or if you're a church planner and it's a community that you want to reach, you pray for that place. That's the first thing. Prayer is both how you do the mission and how you discover your mission. And that's exactly what Jesus did. Then the L. L is for listen. Think, for example, when Jesus heals the blind man, before he does anything, what does he do first? He listens. He actually asks the blind man, do you want to be healed? And then he listens. That's the second practice we see in the life of Jesus. And here's the thing. I'm convinced that as believers, as Christians, we are more known for our talking than our listening. And that needs to change. It was actually said by the inventor of the stethoscope. He would teach his students, he would say this: listen to your patients, and they will tell you how to heal them. That's the second practice, listen. Then the third practice, E, stands for eat. Jesus did this. One of the great grievances of the religious establishment that they had with Jesus was that he was always what? Eating and drinking with sinners. And that was a part of his everyday, how he lived out the mission. And here's the thing. Most people I talk to, good church-going folks, people in my church, people in your church, they want to be a part of the mission. They want to see other people come to faith. But when we start throwing at them programs and, challenge them to do things, crazy things like I used to do, okay? Whether it's, certain evangelistic programs, they're going like, man, it's just one more thing. I don't know if I can do it. But if you think about this, we already eat how many times every week? 3 times a day, 7 days a week, 21 times. Begin to think of those as 21 opportunities already in your schedule, okay, to reach out, share your faith, do evangelism with other people. So that's the third practice, was eat. The fourth one is serve. In Matthew 20:28, Jesus clarifies his strategic approach to the mission. He says this: I came not to serve, not to be served, rather, but to serve. That's what he says. The early church got this, and that's why they experienced a missional movement. Begin with prayer, listen, eat, serve. These are all things Jesus did. And the last thing is in story. Share your own story. And so when Jesus got the opportunity, he said, listen, I'm the way, I'm the truth, I'm the life. And there's nothing the matter with proclamation. Proclamation is important, and church has been great at that. And it's essential. But maybe it doesn't have to be first. In fact, maybe it should be last, because that's when they're ready to actually hear from us. Well, as I read this doctoral dissertation, as I saw it actually in Genesis 12, and then I began to see it in the life of Jesus, I said, okay, I need to try this myself. So let me tell you about a friend of mine named Michael. Michael's a guy who began with prayer. One of the things I would do in my journal, I would pull out my journal, and I would actually got to the place where I would write out the word bless, and then I would write maybe a half dozen or up to a dozen different names. And one of the names I'd write in that journal was Michael. Now, just so you know a little about Michael, Michael's not the kind of guy who would just walk into a church. In fact, Michael's the kind of guy who it would just never occur to him that a church would have something to offer him. There was no need, there was no program, there was nothing that they would offer him or his family. Part of his story, he grew up in an abusive home, moved out on his own at the young age of 15, managed to finish high school, went off to college, actually excelled as a Division I athlete, and not too long after that married a beautiful woman, and then in time actually was able to start a healthcare company that became very large, and he became rather wealthy. Well, both of our sons, okay, now we're going to move into the listen part. run on the same cross-country team, same track team, and one of the best teams in the state. And so we would go to these meets and we would hang out together, and we became friends. Our two boys were also friends, my son Caleb and his son Austin. Caleb even invited him to one of our student community events, and Austin really began to show an interest in that and a real interest in spiritual things that began to change Austin's life, and my friend Michael began to see how that was changing his son's life. And so we had this affinity for sports. We had this affinity for both of our love for our boys. And so whenever we were at these track meets or cross-country meets, we would talk. And of course, as a friend, the second practice, I would listen. Well, in time, and this is actually Michael's doing, and maybe he knew I was a pastor, I don't know, but the conversation turned towards spiritual things. And it was actually his suggestion, hey, we should go out to breakfast sometime. And pretty soon, breakfast started being kind of a routine. We would do that, or occasionally he'd find a different restaurant, because he was kind of a connoisseur of sorts, and we'd go check out a new restaurant. But as I got to know Michael, I'll never forget the breakfast meal or the moment when he looked at me and he said, hey, Dave, for 20 years, I've felt like I've had the burden of not just living one life, but of living two lives. This guy I've been praying for, this guy I've been listening to as a friend, we're now eating together, and he begins to share his story with me. Part of his story was that when Michael was in grad school out in California, him and his best friend Jay went for a drive. Michael had been the best man at his wedding. Michael was planning on getting married. He wanted Jay to be the best man at his wedding. Michael would even say of his friend Jay, he said he was just a terrific human being, a very moral guy, a very spiritual guy. He says, the kind of guy I wanted to be, I aspired to be. They went for a drive and they got in a car accident. Michael survived. Michael's best friend Jay did not. And Michael saw Jay die in that car. Michael had been negligent. He actually did some time. It was Jay's parents, that held him accountable for their son's death, wanted nothing to do with Michael. And so from that moment on, he lived with the guilt and the shame of that incident. So when he got out of jail, he moved away from Southern California, and he never, ever spoke of the incident. Nobody knew of it except his wife. And so for 20 years, he lived with the burden of, as he described it, living not just one life, but trying to live two lives, one for him and one for his friend Jay. And he's telling me this. Now, Michael, being the CEO, used to being the boss. I remember at breakfast, he said, okay, here's what I want. He said, I want you to be my spiritual coach. I've hired other people who are executive coaches. I want you to be my spiritual coach. And so after telling me that, we continued to meet. We would talk about running. We'd talk about life, but we'd also talk about spiritual things. And we'd talk about what would he do with this burden that he was carrying. And it was that moment, it was actually February at that breakfast table where he said, it was 20 years ago today that my friend was killed, and he explained it. So now, I've served him, right, by listening to him, by being his spiritual coach. And now it's my chance to share my story and how Jesus has changed my life and how I've seen him change other people's lives. I've prayed, I've listened, we've eaten together, I've served him. And so I began to share with them that Jesus can offer you forgiveness. And not only that, but he can also take your story, whatever it is, no matter how horrific or bad it is, and he can bring redemption. And I can't tell you, or maybe I have because you've experienced this, what good news that was for Michael. And it was so awesome for me to be there in that moment, at that breakfast table, where he says yes to Jesus. And he says yes to forgiveness. And he says yes to God's redemptive power to take a horrific story that is such bad news and then somehow turn into good news that he can share with other people. And I'll tell you, it has just been a huge privilege for me to see God at work in Michael's life. Well, here's Michael's story.
I really did not have a relationship with God, and I did not think about it. It wasn't a goal or objective of mine. And my mentality was, if you want to get something done, you can only really rely on you. And so that's the way I approached the world for many, many years. My name is Michael Kinney. I'm married to Stacy, and I have 4 children, Austin, Zachary, Aiden, and Zane, and I've been coming to community for 2 years. Jay was my roommate in graduate school. So February of 1997, Jay and I went to go see a concert. And on the way home from that concert, back to our apartment, we were in a car wreck. Jay died in the car wreck, extremely emotionally devastated by the loss of my friend. And I felt very responsible, and I was very, very angry with God. So I decided then that I'm going to live 2 lives, one for me and one for Jay. And I began trying to do that through my activities. Everything that I would achieve, it never was enough. It never made me feel differently. I still felt very angry, very alone. It didn't matter how hard I tried or what I accomplished. Something was still missing. And my oldest son, Austin, he began going to church with his good friend Caleb. I remember he got baptized, and it really took me aback that he had, on his own, figured out something that I could never figure out. And so I began going to church with a more open mind, trying to pay attention to the signs and to the messages that people were sharing with me. I also have a son who has severe autism, and he has, no ego. And so I have this wonderful reflection of what Jesus Christ looks like without ego with my son Aiden. So the combination of watching Austin and watching and reflecting on my relationship with Aiden really turned my views from egoicism and hubris to humility. And then I was invited to go to a small group, and I knew sort of what that was, but I didn't really know what it was. I'd never been in a small group, and I was very nervous. Very nervous to attend my first session. Particularly the subject was on regret. I remember thinking, wow, how apropos that my first small group is on the subject that I need to learn the most about. And it really opened my eyes. The kind of the tipping point for me was on the 20th anniversary of this car accident, which killed my friend. It's a dark day for me, a very upsetting day, and my family doesn't have any idea, except for my wife. Why am I so upset? Not just all of the time, why am I sort of angry all of the time, but why am I particularly upset this day? What I found was that after I started sharing this story, particularly with my family, and then in some cases with my close friends, that every single time I talked about what happened, it was like I was taking a brick out of the bag and putting it on the ground, and my load was just getting lighter and lighter and lighter. And every single time I did it, I felt better. For most of my life, I thought that asking for help was a sign of weakness. And what I've come to realize is that asking for help is really a sign of strength. And that if you really want some help and you really want to go to the right place, the best place to go is asking God for help and accepting Jesus into your life.
I'll tell you what, I love that story. I could watch that over and over again, because that's why I do what I do. And I know that's what motivates you as well. And I'm telling you, these blessed practices are things that we see. I think we see it in the very beginning, that God said, hey, I'm going to bless you and you bless others. That's how we're going to change the world. And then we see it in Jesus. And we see Jesus actually using these practices to bless people. And what's so great about these blessed practices, particularly today, is you're onto something that really comes straight from the Gospels when you see it work in every culture and every time. Because even right now, in the middle of a stay-at-home order, like many of us are still in the middle of a COVID crisis, these blessed practices work. Let me explain to you how they can work even now. Begin with prayer. You can continue to pray for your neighbors, even though you're in a stay-at-home. In fact, this has become so popular. If you want, there's an app out there. We didn't even invent this one. Someone else picked up on it, but it's called blesseveryhome.com. You can go to the website and you can get the app, blesseveryhome.com. And you go there and actually list your neighbors' names and addresses with helpful ideas for how you can pray for them. You can go on a prayer walk through your neighborhood. You can ask God to bless you as you walk past their apartments or their buildings or their homes in your neighborhood. So you can still begin with prayer. Listen. Again, as long as you keep your distance, right? These days we're talking about 6 feet. You can talk to people in your neighborhood. If you're not comfortable with, or other people aren't comfortable with kind of the face-to-face, then these people that you're praying for, you can still text them and have them text back to you. You can use FaceTime. You can use Zoom. You can use Google Hangout. Just checking in with those people. How are you doing? I would tell you this, more than any other time before, because of the isolation, you just reaching out and listening and checking in how are you doing with the people that you're praying for is a way that you can love them. So we can still pray for these people. We can still listen to them. Now you're going, oh, what about eat? You know what you can do? Here's what you can do. You can offer to provide a meal. Use a food delivery app. Or better yet, don't ask, just surprise somebody. Buy an extra delicious treat when you're doing your grocery store shopping and then drop it off. And you'll get a thank you, and that gives you another chance to interact with them. Or schedule a Zoom lunch, right? You make your lunch at your home or your apartment, and they make theirs in their home or their apartment, and schedule with them. You can still pray, you can still listen, you can still eat. You can still do those things even in this stay-at-home environment. The first S, serve. Now, social distancing means we have to be creative about this. But things you can do with those people. Write a thank you note to them when they reciprocate and they do things for you. You can share things. Toilet paper. Turns out it's a big commodity these days. Share toilet paper. Figure out what needs people have. More specifically, figure out what needs those people have, and in creative ways, you can still do that for them. And when the time comes, okay, the last S is story. And I'm telling you, I believe in this crisis, we have a greater opportunity than ever before to share the story of Jesus. People are searching. People are lonely. People are looking for spiritual answers. They're looking for something other than themselves to make sense out of what's going on. Look for an opportunity at the right time to share your story, because people are searching more than ever before. All right, so here's the thing. How do we do this? Here are 5 simple, everyday ways to love your neighbor, and maybe even change the world. Begin with prayer, listen, eat, serve, and share your story. All right, love you guys.